we go from Brown Eyed Girl to Fallen, or from Buddy Holly to Metallica? It's kind of hard to tell, but it's easy to see that these styles of music evolved from each other. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. The thing that drove that evolution was the individual and cultural desire to artistically push boundaries. And this desire has existed from the very beginning. So let's go all the way to the beginning, to medieval chant. It's not the first form of music, but it's among the first we can actually talk about in the Western tradition because it's one of the first to have been written down. And to say that it was written down is kind of generous because at first all that was written down was just the words and some vague indication of pitch. The different church choirs would just kind of make up the music on their own. They would have a leader pointing to the words and the pitches, and they would tap each other on the shoulder to stay together. Clearly, this left a lot of room for interpretation, but since the point of chants was to meditate on the words as a kind of worship, not a lot of emphasis was put into musical expression as we know it today. A pretty significant development came around the ninth century, when churches got a little more creative and decided that instead of having a bunch of people singing the same single melody, you could have that melody sung in different pitches, but at the same time. This is called harmony, and as a concept, it continued to develop throughout the ages and continues to develop today. The guitar chords in Brown Eyed Girl and Alicia Keys' vocals in Fallen are examples of harmony. Another breakthrough that followed was the idea that in the harmony, you could sing more than one note for every note of the original line. This obviously required a lot more coordination, so the notation system was radically developed to include both the pitches that you should sing and when to sing them. This new broader framework allowed for a lot more creativity and innovation, and it resulted in the development of more complex musical practices like counterpoint and polyphony. In the 15th century, the Renaissance was spreading throughout Europe, and for music, this meant that personal expression was now more valued. Now, personal or religious expression was at the forefront of musical achievement, and music took on a much bigger role in society. This effect was amplified even more by the fact that music could be printed now. This and the rise of the middle class meant that many more people could enjoy both listening to and playing music. The music itself changed too. With the new creative tools and desire for expression, music became more elaborate and exciting. Audiences went to church expecting to be uplifted and overcome by the music, and composers kept themselves on the very cutting edge of musical style. Sometimes, composers would take a song that the audience already knew as a basis and then build new music on top of that, and that was called contrafact. It had kind of like the same effect as sampling does in modern music. As the desire for expression continued to develop more and more, it eventually culminated in a more direct form of expression of characters and stories in the form of opera, which now brings us to the Baroque period. Now, going to listen to music was really an exciting event. You could go to an opera and see a bunch of characters acting out an incredible story, and at the same time be swept off your feet by this new, elaborate music. Like movies, the opera could be funny, or sad, or tragic, or dramatic, but it would always give the composer an opportunity to show off their skills. And showing off really was a part of this era. The Baroque period is known for its complexity and extravagance, not just in music, but also in art and architecture. People went to concerts and operas to be blown away by elegant and elaborate, complex music. Like in jazz, musicians were improvisers, So they would often go up on stage and make this incredibly complicated music right there on the spot. It's like going to a rock concert and seeing the guitarist absolutely shredding on his solo, except instead of Van Halen on the guitar, it was Bach on the harpsichord. This was also a great time for instrumentalists, because Baroque music started to give more importance to each individual instrument. So, composers wanted to make music where each instrument had a more full sound and played a more important role in the whole of the piece. This gave rise to the orchestra, which started to take shape as we know it today. In the middle of the 18th century, the European consciousness started changing again. The extravagance of the Baroque era was starting to get off putting, and people started looking back for inspiration. They looked to the ancient Greeks and Romans with a sort of nostalgia and wanted to emulate their simplicity and natural understanding of life. This marked a shift into the classical period. In music, the complexity and lavishness of the Baroque period was starting to get a little obnoxious and over the top, so music started to become lighter and more simple. Kind of like the Strokes, looking back to 90s rock and emulating that nostalgic sound, classical composers looked all the way back to ancient Greece and wanted to emulate that light simplicity that they felt in their art. The orchestra really started taking off at this point, and composers wrote clear, tasteful melodies accompanied by clear, predictable harmonies. The harmonic sequence that was developed would persist in classical music and in popular music, all the way to modern times. For example, the 1-5-6-4 progression, which arguably comes from the classical tradition, is notorious for belonging to an absurd number of songs from all modern genres. The public also started to like light comic operas more than dramatic ones, and opera itself started to become the favorite form of entertainment for the masses. Most of the big name composers of the classical period, like Mozart, actually made their living mostly from opera. And while it might be hard to imagine you and your friends and pretty much everyone you know getting pumped up to go and see the opera, you might actually be surprised at how relatable that experience would be for you even today. So, check out the next video to learn a little bit more about how opera was enjoyed by people just like you.